You here, G.I.? Conan asked. The cords in Miller's neck bulged with strained effort. He snapped his jaws shut over Conan's fingers, and his teeth clacked against bone. Conan yowled and jerked his hand away. Strips of flesh were peeled off into Miller's mouth. Miller retched and spat out the bloody ribbons of skin. Miller was struck in the face with the pliers, and he hit the ground, screaming. The coal scorched his flesh. His skin sizzled and popped. He shrieked in agony, and his arms tugged uselessly against their bonds. Conan kicked the air from his lungs. The dogs howled with Miller. Miller spat boiling blood. His cheek blistered into a bright white welt. "Bad G.I., very bad G.I., Conan hissed. He silenced the dogs with a wave of his hand. Miller gasped heavily. The heat of the burn sucked the air from his lungs. Conan grabbed Miller by the throat and dragged him to the smoldering pit. The intensity of the heat doubled with each step closer. Miller thrashed and kicked, but the other guerrillas surrounded him and beat him down. Conan held Miller's head over the embers. His facial hair was scorched off. The heat dug into his blistered cheek like the nails of wraiths. Conan was silent and patient, methodical as a serpent. "You have one last chance for penance," Conan said. "Why are you here? Tell me your sins, demon." Miller didn't speak as he stared into the pulsating light of the embers. The coals hissed and spat. Conan shook Miller out of his stupor and lowered him closer. The heat became unbearable. He could feel the water of his eyes beginning to boil. "We found the bodies of your Green Beret, demon," Conan said. "We've been watching your friends. We know there are others. If you don't tell me why you are here, I'm going to drop you." Miller imagined falling through those embers into eternal darkness and fire. He felt Conan's claws digging into the veins of his throat. "I'm here because you shot a helicopter, asshole," Miller choked. Conan threw Miller backwards into the mud. Miller coughed and thanked God he hadn't fallen. Conan stood over him, sucking a lungful of opium. His shoulders relaxed. He barked a string of Vietnamese, and a pair of guerrillas came around the fire. They dragged another man by his bound arms. A sack was tied over the man's head, but Miller immediately knew it was Nguyen, the boy from the helicopter. Nguyen begged frantically in his native tongue. Conan watched Miller with cold, dark eyes. "Do you know this whelp, demon?" Conan asked. "Help me, please!" Nguyen howled. Miller rolled onto his stomach and stared up at Conan. He prayed his face didn't give away his panic. "No, I don't," Miller said. "If you don't know him, then he isn't worth keeping alive," Conan said. "You demons have let my fellow countrymen die. You've murdered our families and led our brothers against us. It won't make a difference if I end his life, will it?" Conan ripped the sack away from Nguyen's head and pulled a knife from his belt. Miller immediately recognized his rosary wrapped around the hilt, a gift from his Nana after his first communion. Rage blinded Miller's pain. Conan pressed the blade against Nguyen's throat and dragged it across his skin. Blood seeped from the gentle wound. Nguyen panicked and cried fearfully. Conan pulled the knife away and slammed the hilt against Nguyen's temple, knocking him unconscious. He poised to slash Nguyen's throat open. Miller's eyes jumped from the blade to Nguyen's young face. Miller saw the embers staring through him like the eyes of judgment. "He's just a kid, you bastard!" Miller barked. "I'll talk. Just leave him alone." A rotten smile spread across Conan's face. His teeth were glistening fangs. "As you wish," Conan hissed. A pair of guerrillas grabbed Miller by his arms and dragged him towards a dark, dilapidated thatch hut across the camp. Another pair of Viet Cong dragged Nguyen back into the shadows. The dogs howled and barked. Conan walked beside Miller, pressing a coal against the K-bar till the blade glowed red-hot. Panic swam through Miller's body. He couldn't take his eyes off the crucifix hanging from the fiery blade. Conan cackled hideously. Miller knew hell. Chapter 27. The River Styx. The Americans' patrol boat scythed through glittering green waves, skipping across the water like a stone. The lush tropical banks blurred around the boat until they became dark walls of a tunnel. Ibex pushed the throttle and the patrol boat lurched, a spire of order spraying from the propellers. Bishop and Ozzy laughed. Andre clutched desperately at his seat. The roar of the engines drowned the sounds of the jungle and the wind that howled in their ears. Eli was indifferent to the adrenaline rush. He leaned against the boat's railing and dangled his copper flask over the spitting wash. Vietnam's endless rivers had come to define his life in the war. Years ago, after Eli's near-death experience in Hue City, his and Miller's platoon had been sent into Vietnam's darkest heart to search for Viet Cong in the villages where no other soldiers dared to set foot. They had spent nearly a year riding from village to village on different patrol boats, always dreading their next destination. Eli never knew if the next stop would be his last. He carried his fear on those eternal boat rides, always dreaming of the boat that would finally carry him home. That ride was always promised, but never delivered. Their officers kept demanding higher kill counts. The more Viet Cong they killed, the greater the promise of escape. Eli had fantasized of escape while on those rivers. Alcohol was the next best thing. Eli took a biting gulp from the flask. The familiar pain was comforting. It was better than the pain of silence. Without Miller, Eli was condemned to his thoughts. He hated his memories. He hated who he had become, the things he had done in those villages along the river. Simply probing those memories made Eli push the flask against his lips and suck it like it was a mother's teat. His addiction was the greatest love he had ever known. It was in his blood. He was a red-blooded Kentuckian raised by generations of alcoholics. His scorched throat was a reminder of home, a distraction from the eyes of a dead child that stared from within. Eli wanted to stay sober for Miller's sake, but this river was leading him towards a terrifying destination. He didn't want to think of where they would arrive or how they would find Miller. He was afraid of the memories that rose in the silence of Miller's absence, the screams in the darkness of his mind. Eli was content to ride the river forever if it meant never arriving, that the journey wouldn't end. He wanted ignorance. He wanted to forget. He'd give anything to drift away. Ryan watched Eli from the corner of his eye. He had been meaning to confront Eli on his drinking habit, but there wasn't enough time. If Eli proved to be more trouble than he was worth, Ryan would leave him with Bishop's team. He already had one addict to worry about. Andre was currently in the throes of morphine withdrawal. The young scientist was sickly pale and shone with profuse sweat. He was curled in the fetal position at the back of the boat, fighting nausea. Ryan understood the feeling. He had spent innumerous nights suffering the same as Andre, years ago during his first trials as captain of Vulture Squad. Ryan staggered across the bucking boat and dropped into the seat beside Andre. Gauze and stitches covered Andre's battered face. Andre watched Ryan with glazed, sunken eyes. His teeth ground through his lower lip. What do you want?" Andre groaned. His fingernails stripped skin from the infected sore on his forearm. Ryan grimaced behind his mask. "I want to know more," Ryan said. "I saved you from a life in the stockades. I think I deserve some answers about where the dinosaurs came from." "Yeah, saved me," Andre scoffed. He retched and dry-heaved. His ribs constricted, his lungs dry. Ryan winced at the contractions as Andre collapsed in a fit of hacking coughs. Spit flew from his blackened gums. "If you want to save me, get me a fix, fast," Andre wheezed. "Please." "Not a chance, Andre," Ryan said. "Now tell me about the dinosaurs." "Well, it was worth a shot," Andre sighed. He pulled his knees into his chest. "When we test-fired the collider, we created a wormhole that the dinosaurs came out of. Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Utahraptors, anything and everything just emerged from the wormhole. The dinosaurs nearly destroyed the compound trying to get away." Andre clutched at his sides and groaned. Ryan offered him his canteen, but Andre shook his head. He inhaled sharply through his teeth, hissing, and he continued. "After the dinosaurs escaped, Borodin had the compound rebuilt and development on a second collider commenced. I was against it, so he had me sent to a research station to study the dinosaurs and how they fit into the local ecosystem.